G'day everybody, welcome to the workshop. Today I'm going to be making a new handle for this little hatchet, little tomahawk. This is a cheap hatchet. The handle is particularly not good and I'm going to put a nice timber one on it. This handle's actually fallen out. I use this for chopping up kindling. I'm not trying to make an award-winning piece of furniture here. It just needs to work again. I'm going to take you through the process. Okay, first things first, timber selection. We need a wood that is hard, really durable, resistant to splitting and cracking, and there are so many that would be good for this and some that would be terrible. Pine, too soft. Oregon, too soft. Lots of other things, too soft. On the other end of the spectrum, something like ironbark, spotted gum, white mahogany, in terms of Aussie hardwoods, would be really, really nice and strong and very heavy. I know in the States they often use hickory, I believe. I have some Blackwood here. This is on the softer end of what would be acceptable, but it's still gonna be strong enough because this is just a little splitter. I would not make a big axe handle out of this, but this is what I have, and I'm gonna give it a shot. Second important thing is grain orientation. If we look at the end of the grain here, this part of the grain, more or less, is quarter sawn, which means the grain goes across. That grain kind of goes like that. Because of where this was cut out of the tree, the grain down here, more or less, runs that way. What this means is that we can choose whether we want the grain to be running with the axe handle or against it. And this is really important for the strength and the longevity of the axe handle. The best place to take this axe handle from is going to be down here. It means the layers that comprise the timber are all going to be sitting next to each other in this orientation. So as the force of the axe head is pushing backwards, that sandwich of grain resists splitting. If we were to run the grain the other way, it's more likely to split. So I'm going to be trying to take my axe handle from that section there. The other thing in terms of grain orientation is we want to make sure that we don't have grain run out. What that means is that we want the axe handle to exist within those lines of grain. I've drawn some on here. To do a very bad example, you would not want the axe taken out of a piece like that because essentially you have lots and lots of stacks of short grain. Instead, we want the edge of the axe handle to align as closely as possible to the grain. So in this big slab, I have the luxury of making sure that I'm splitting this timber in a way that the grain lines up really well. You'll want to avoid any timber that has knots or splits or sap lines or any other imperfections like that that might add a weakness. On this little slab here, there's some interesting grain stuff going on here, so I don't want anything to do with that. I'm going to keep it down in this section here. This process is made infinitely easier if you have an axe handle that you can trace. If you do not, I would probably recommend downloading one and printing one out. There's a reason that these are shaped the way that they are. It's not the kind of thing you necessarily want to just eyeball. I mean, you can. I'm all for making things yourself. You could just shove a straight stick in there, but the ergonomics of it wouldn't be great. And tracing an axe handle that already exists is going to give you a better result. Plus, there's just plenty of patterns online that you can print out. If you did want to draw your own, you'd probably need to watch a whole tutorial about figuring out what the direction of that S-curve needs to be. But essentially, an axe handle points back towards your wrist at the handle part, and then the head kind of goes up straight and a little bit forward where the axe head goes. Again, I'm not going to teach you how to get into the shaping of that, more just how to actually create it. Once you've laid your existing axe handle that you want to trace, or your template, on your piece of timber, we're going to trace it out with a pencil. You want to make sure that the new blank that you're tracing is slightly larger than the old one, so you can shape it down to the exact size, potentially give yourself some extra length on the top so that you can chop that off. It is going to go through the axe head, poke out the other side, and then we'll chop off the excess. So give yourself an extra 20 mil or so there. If you need to, you can use double-sided tape to stick your axe handle down onto the timber to make sure you get a really good trace of it. I have not done that. If your old axe handle is really beaten up, it's possible that the eye, which is the part that goes through the eye, is kind of beaten up in the wrong shape. So give yourself a little bit of extra timber up there as well. Okay, now that we've cut out the basic shape and I've smoothed off the edges, we're going to draw the eye on the axe handle. We're actually going to shape the eye first before we finish shaping the handle. If you mess up the shaping of the eye and the axe handle doesn't fit into the head, there's not really much point shaping the handle. Whereas as long as the top fits, there's some things that you can do to get the handle shape right, even if you've kind of messed it up. We're going to draw a center line in the top of the axe handle. You can draw this by eye, or you can use a little marking gauge or whatever you want. And then we're going to place the axe head over the handle and draw through the eye so that we have a shape. Make sure it's facing the right direction. And we're actually going to flip this upside down so that we're drawing the top where that Dusty. Now that I've drawn that eye on the end of the axe handle, I'm going to take away some of that waste on the bandsaw. Blackwood sawdust. Makes me sneeze. Now that we've cut the waste off the cheeks and we have the eye marked on the top of the handle there, we just need to start shaping it. You can use a draw knife like this. You could use a spokeshave potentially. You could just use a regular old file. If you don't have a file, you can get some really coarse sandpaper and double-sided tape it to a piece of wood, and you can make yourself a sandpaper file. I'm going to start by trying to just do the first sort of 20 or 30 mil, make sure that the head goes on, and then work my way down. I'm using that line on the top as the guide, and that's what I'm trying to get close to. At the moment, I'm just trying to stick to the outside of that line. So you can still see the line there. I'm going to work the whole way around, trying to remove that, and then we'll start fitting the handle. Okay, so using the draw knife, I'm now able to get it to go on by about 5 or 10 mil. And what that lets me do is see the friction marks, see where it's hitting, and I can follow those little lines down. That's where the head is going down to, and the same at the front. So I can just keep on following that down. This will be split and wedged, so we're going to be able to expand that timber into the hole anyway. But it's getting there. After I did some initial stock removal with the draw knife, I actually took this to my belt sander setup. I almost never use this belt sander as a horizontal sander or for tabletops or anything. I tend to use my orbital for everything, but this lives in this cradle and it forms a great platform for doing small sanding objects when I need to. Obviously you can buy linishes like this. This is just what I have. And that allowed me to get a really good continual rounded shape on here that followed that tip profile the whole way down. And by continually placing the head over that eye and then observing the places where we were getting rubbing, which you can just see as pressure marks on the eye. You can see that kind of little dark smudge there. That's the rubbing. That was what I knew that I needed to remove. And you can also use pencil as you go along to make sure that you're not removing other things like the top. Now that I know the head is going to fit on the handle, it lets me concentrate on finishing up that handle, knowing that I have a good fit for that little tomahawk head. The next step is to shape this handle, and I'm going to use a spokeshave and a draw knife to do it. I just need to be able to hold it down somehow. I don't have a shave horse, nor do I really have need for one, although there would be, or space for one, more to the point. I'm just going to drill a couple of pieces of scrap directly down to my workbench. This is why I have a chipboard and MDF workbench. I love being able to do this. It means that I'm not thinking about making complicated jigs all the time. I'm just fixing them to the surface. And essentially I'm just making a little cradle for this that I can lift out, flip it around, and shave all the sides without anything getting in my way. When taking any object from square to more round, there's a temptation to just get a sander and sand it off round. But what that will do is give you a really irregular rounded shape. And so what you need to do is create facets first. So if you're going for a square and then you want to go to a circle, you first create an octagon by taking an equal corner, an equal chamfer off every side. And then you move from an octagon to whatever the next shape would be, I guess 16 sides. And that allows you to get closer and closer to a perfect circle. Now, we're not going for a circle here, but we're kind of going for that teardrop shape. And so I'm going to create equal facets on every corner, and that'll allow me to get the feel for it before I start really rounding them over. I'm going to be creating those facets with a spoke shave. This is a round sole spoke shave. What that means is that the sole is slightly rounded, and it means you can shave on the inside of a curve. This is a Melbourne Tool Company one. I like it because you've got really easy adjustment with these dials here that you just don't get from some of my other spoke shaves, like my Lubin, which is a fine spoke shave, but to adjust it, you've got to tap it with a hammer or tap it on the bench. If you're concerned about getting these facets even, you can actually draw yourself a guideline. Because this shape is more rectangular than square, our chamfers aren't going to be a straight 45. They might be more like 30 degrees so that we're taking more material off this long face than this short face. And what that means is that our guideline just needs to be slightly further in on the long face than the short face. I'll start by, I'm not going to use a marking gauge for this because it's a curved surface. There are other ways you could do it, but I'm just going to block a pencil with my finger and then run my finger along the edge. And that's going to allow me to create this guideline that's the same distance from the edge the whole way along. And I was looking at the pencil, and basically where that red painted surface finishes, that was where I was holding the pencil on the edge of the timber. So I can copy that on the other side, lock my finger in place, follow that line, and that gets me two guidelines that I want to be the extent of my chamfer. I'll do that on the opposite side as well. These don't have to be perfect. This is a fairly organic shape, but this is a good technique for getting consistent chamfers if you're doing them by hand. Now these lines on the narrower side, they need to be less deep. So I'm going to push my finger closer to the tip of the pencil and do a shallower chamfer. Keep your finger in the same place, turn it around, do the next side, and they look really consistent. Now I have my guidelines, I can start shaving down to those lines. Because we're kind of going in and out of the grain, there are going to be some areas that tear out more than others, but we'll hog out the shape, get as much material removed as possible, see how it feels, and then we can go with the grain in places where we need to finish that up and clean it up. Okay, that's one side done. That chamfer is right up to those lines. You can't necessarily just follow that line and expect your chamfer to become even. You're going to have to do more passes in some areas and less in others, or at least I do. Maybe that's a skill thing, I'm not sure. All right, and we can flip it over and do the other side. It goes pretty quickly with a sharp spoke shave. You could remove material more quickly with a draw knife, but this is really controlled. If you're finding that awkward or you don't want to drill into your bench, you can also just put this in a vise. It means you can't necessarily do the entire chamfer in one go, but you can come from one side and then come from the other. And that will work for some of it as well. I'm just adding the next set of layout lines to bring that chamfer deeper. So I've got 2 lines a little further in on this face and on the edge. It's just still feeling too chunky. It needs to become much narrower all the way around. So just keep on shaving. Once you've continued that facet and got the basic shape that you wanted, then you can just start kind of rounding off those edges. You could do that on a bobbin sander. You can continue to do it on a spoke shave. It does get harder to hold the more round it gets. A little simple cradle like this will hold it, but you kind of need to make it slightly taller and slightly firmer. But from this point, a lot of stuff can be done by sanding as long as the shape feels okay. You're really just rounding it off. Right now, this back part feels too sharp in my palm, so I really need to round that over, and that's gonna make that feel nicer. So yeah, a bit more rounding here and here. Now, another important thing, on most little axe handles, there's something called a palm swell, which is where this portion, right down the bottom, is actually wider than the rest of the handle. Often, an additional piece of timber is glued on during this shaping phase to give you that thickness. I'm not gonna do that, I'm keeping it pretty simple, but I am gonna thin out slightly the area just above that where my palm is gonna go. And so that's gonna kind of serve some of the purpose of a palm swell without gluing some on. Okay, I've done my shaping. You can see the pencil mark there is the old face of the timber before it was shaped. So that's my palm swell. And then it tapers down a bit from there. You can see some existing face of the old timber up here too. That means I still have my flat faces, which is gonna make me cutting my kerf in the tongue a little easier. I have tapped this head onto the handle to make sure that it fits, and it does. That's allowed me to draw a line on the tongue so I know how far it's gonna go down. I'm gonna cut my kerf about 2/3 of the way through this axe head, so down to about there. And then I'm going to measure how much gap I have on either side of the tongue and inside the kerf, and then sort of calculate my wedge thickness from there. So that kerf there is about 1.5 mil thick, a little bit less. And there's about 1.5 mil of gap on either side, perhaps a little bit more. So that adds up to about 5 mil, 4.5, 5 mil at the top point here. Perhaps again, a little bit more to allow for expansion. So I want my wedge at the point that it emerges from the face to be about 5 mil. And at its thinnest point, I don't need it to be any thinner than about 1 mil because the kerf of the blade is 1.5. So something around that gives me the shape of this wedge. Roughly 1 mil at the base and about 40 mil up, which is the height of the head, it needs to be about 5 mil. I can shape that on the disc sander, is probably the simplest way to do it, with just applying more pressure at the tip than the base. If I draw a center line on there, I can make sure that I'm approaching that wedge from both sides to make sure the grain stays straight. So I added a base plate to the disc sander because the gap between the sander and the table was thin enough or thick enough for the wedge to fall through, which was dangerous. So by putting a little piece of plywood kind of directly, almost touching the sandpaper, it gives me a zero clearance plate to do fine sanding work. And just by adding pressure on the top of the wedge instead of the bottom, I was able to get this so that those pencil marks still remain, which means the base is the same thickness as it was. And I've gone right down to that line on the tip, which means I've got about 1 mil there, about 5 mil back here. Okay, so I've made my wedge. I've curved it slightly so it matches the profile of the eye, which is, you know, more narrow at the front than the back, so that when it jams in there, it should really fill that space. I think the tape is good. I think the fit is good. The process for fitting this on is you get the axe head down as far as you can. So essentially in the place it needs to be seated onto that tongue. I'm going to use a tiny bit of epoxy on this wedge. Make sure your wedge is really smooth. You don't want saw marks left over from the bandsaw, so get that nice and smooth and sanded. You don't have to use epoxy. I'm using it because I know it's actually going to help this wedge slip down further and then also just bond it really well with the Blackwood. I'm not going to use tight bond because I know that often when I'm doing wedges with tight bond, they tend to jam up about halfway because the glue is so grabby, whereas epoxy is a little bit slipperier. Otherwise, we're good to go. This bit's a little bit nerve-wracking. Place the head on. I'm gonna tap the heel to get the head seated. Okay, the head is seated really nicely. I'm getting a little bit of compression at the back, which is what I want. Place this in my vise just temporarily. I'm going to put a little bit of epoxy on the wedge itself. Not very much. Ideally, there's not a lot of space to fill. I'm sure some people feel pretty strongly about not using glue, but this is my video, so you can yell at me in the comments. Okay, wedge goes in. I'm going to tap it down here, and then I'm going to turn the whole thing upside down and whack it on a piece of timber on the floor so that I'm not splitting the wedge. Going in nicely so far. It's about as far as it wants to go there. After a bit of fiddling around, I've got the wedge to go in pretty square, so I can just let that dry, get any epoxy off the head, and then saw it off. And I'm gonna have an axe head set really well. The process of placing the axe head on the handle is called hanging the axe head. These are all things that I'm learning about the same time that you are. Look at that pretty wedge. Straight up and down, even split on either side of the wedge. Handle just needs a bit of a sand now. I could have done that before seating that, but it's fine. I'm not gonna get this glassy smooth. I don't mind it being slightly faceted. It's more or less smooth anyway. I'm gonna give that a sand and then we'll throw some oil on it. Whenever I get towards the end, closer to the end of a project and I start working on a piece, this applies for a table or whatever, bedside table, I start working on a soft surface. So a blanket or a pad like this. It just means that as you're working, as you're smoothing it off, you're not just damaging the surface further every time you flip it over. This made me sneeze yesterday, so I'm gonna wear a mask. Okay, now for the fun bit. Well, I mean, spoke shaving is fun, but adding oil to timber is also nice. To oil this handle, I'm going to be using this Selder & Co. linseed oil. It is a drying linseed oil. It's all in Swedish, so I don't know much about it, except I know that it works better and dries faster with heat. So you can either heat the oil gently, or you can heat the piece gently and apply, or you can do both. It will work without heating. It'll just dry more slowly, and I feel like it's going to help it penetrate. So I'm going to use a heat gun to heat the handle until it feels warm to the touch. I'll apply the oil and then apply a bit more heat. Traditionally with axe handles, you'd apply, I think, 1 coat every day for 3 or 4 days and then 1 coat every month for a little while after that. It builds up a protective layer that's not too slippery and can be easily refreshed as it gets beaten around. Now this is an indoor hatchet. It doesn't need that much protection, but you're better off using a penetrating oil than some other kind of surface that sits on top because the top's just gonna get bashed up. Whenever you're applying oil with a rag, smaller rag, better than big rag. Otherwise you're just soaking up oil that's being wasted in the rag itself. When you go to buff it off, you can use a larger one. This Blackwood is really soaking this up, which is great. I actually really like the smell of linseed oil, especially good linseed oil. Bit more heat. Bit more oil. With any kind of oil like this, you want to really flood the surface to let it soak in. But then you don't want to leave a heap on the surface as it's drying because it's just going to get sticky. So flood the surface, let it soak in, and then after a little while, buff any excess off and leave it someplace to dry. Okay, that handle is nice and warm, so that oil is really soaking into the pores. I don't think any more is going to soak in. That is looking and feeling wonderful. What a huge improvement over that horrible fiberglass thing. Well set, strong, actually fairly light. Beautiful little kindling axe. Alrighty, thanks a lot for watching. I hope you got something out of that. You don't have to go and buy a handle. You can cut and shape and hang one yourself. And look, it's just a really satisfying process. I love working with a spoke shave like that. I love organic shapes. It's just a really nice way to work, a great way to spend the afternoon. And then every time you hold your little axe or your little hatchet, you'll know that you made that handle, and you can make another one if you need to. There'll be links down below to the products I've used, like the spoke shave and the oil and other bits and pieces. If you have any questions or any abuse that you want to hurl at me because of my totally inadequate, bad axe handle shaping advice, then absolutely get in the comments and let me know. I am not a professional axe handle shaper or anything like that, so I'd love to learn more. And yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.